from the vault. High atop the pastoral center of the Diocese of Camden, you're listening to Talking Catholic.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Talking Catholic. I'm Jen Mauro, and with me today is Mike Walsh. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Jen, how are you?
Good. Happy New Year.
Wait, are we still allowed to say that?
I think so. It's only a couple days in.
Okay, fine. But I'm telling you, come Sunday, come the 9th, no more Happy New Year.
Really?
Yeah.
I gotta find something happy to be happy about. You gotta find something happy to be happy about. How do you like that?
There you go. Well said as always.
Words or something to be happy about in the new year.
No, it was this week. We took an extended break from the podcast. We had 2 weekends in a row where we didn't do a podcast, which I believe is the first time I've done that in the history of the podcast. And I don't know how I feel about that, but I actually got to take a Christmas week vacation down to Virginia Beach to see some family. Had a great time. And I will admit that it was nice to not worry about cranking out an episode at the end of the year. So thank you to our listeners for giving me a break. I appreciate that.
I missed the podcast. I missed having something to tune into on Sunday at 11 on my way home from Mass.
Okay, fine.
I mean, I guess you still deserved a week off, but I did miss the podcast.
Well, wait, you missed listening to our own podcast on Domestic Church Radio?
I missed our own voices, is what I'm saying. Yes.
Okay, that's nice. There's no vanity in that. I understand.
Not at all.
It was nice. And you had, aside from the fact that you are currently recovering from COVID, which is why we're doing this via Zoom, you had a nice Christmas break.
I did. It was some nice downtime. I got to spend some time with my family before the invasion of the COVID. So, got to spend time with family, got to go to Mass on Christmas Eve. Not midnight Mass. We have 6 p.m. Mass. That's the latest we get, but it was beautiful as always. And it was just a nice, relaxing week. This is the first New Year's. I intentionally fell asleep before midnight since I had the COVID, intentionally being the key word there. But the fireworks in the neighborhood woke me up at 12 o'clock with calls from my loved ones. So it was good.
Oh, that's nice. Mm-hmm. I did 2 masses on Christmas, 6 p.m. to cover Bishop Sullivan's mass at Incarnation Parish. And then 11 p.m., which I guess counts as midnight so long as it ended past midnight mass. Mm-hmm. Or past the time of midnight. But that was nice. Always enjoy it because our pastor likes to dim the lights. So if I tried just a little harder, I might have been able to take a nap in the middle of Mass, which I was told by a priest once that it was okay to fall asleep in Mass because that's just how comfortable you were in that space that you were, because we're all home at that time and you can if it's okay to fall asleep in Mass.
Interesting.
Or we may have been drinking heavily and he was just messing around with me. One or the other.
More likely. But, that does bring up a good point. I have actually asked my pastor one time if I could sleep in the church not during Mass. Because, sometimes you just feel like, I don't know, sometimes I just feel like I want to be, held by faith. I know that sounds weird. And I would just like to go to church, pray, and then kind of just, curl up in the back pew and sleep in the presence of God. I don't know if that's really allowed because I don't remember what my pastor said at this time, but that is something I've always wanted to do. We'll ask the guest later today since we have a priest on the show today, if that is allowed.
I'm very curious to see what that response is going to be. Well, you know what? It is the new year, and we are looking forward to it's going to be an interesting year, certainly in the Diocese of Camden, as well as in the church writ large. There are a number of things that we're coming down the pike that we're looking forward to. I will admit that I'm already in Lent mode. I am already, not so much in Lent mode, not spiritually in Lent mode, but I'm already looking towards Lent and some of the work that we have coming down the pike. And we're actually ramping up in the Diocese of Camden, we're ramping up to a big Eucharistic Congress at the end of March. And we just had a meeting earlier where we were talking about our I Race for Vocations, which is going to be happening in the end of April. And it was just kind of nice. It's I oftentimes think of January as sort of a dead time in the church, in the sense that there's not anything other than Epiphany coming up. There isn't anything like massive to kind of fixate on for a little while. So everyone can kind of chill out for a little bit, and it's sort of the ramp up to Lent. But actually, I'm already in that mode. So it makes me happy. I'm excited. I like it when we can talk about the activity of the church.
No. I mean, January, without a doubt, is already going to be super busy. We have a lot of important things coming up in the Catholic Church, like the March for Life. Catholic Schools Week will be at the end of the month. But I'm still embracing the Christmas season, especially with Epiphany on Sunday. So I don't know. I'm still embracing that. I'm not ready for the big rush yet. I want to embrace the Christmas season.
No, I never look backwards, Jen. It's always forward. What's coming up next? What's the next thing I have to motivate me? That's what I'm concerned
I am
about.
Honestly terrible about living in the present. I am also always looking to the future, but I don't know. I'm feeling it today. You talked about spending Christmas Eve with Bishop Sullivan. I think that was in Woodbury Heights, right?
Yeah, Incarnation Parish. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Infant Jesus. Infant Jesus.
Infant Jesus. That mass was live streamed. He had a beautiful homily that evening about being present with the baby Jesus. I recommend anybody go back, rewatch the live stream if you didn't see it. And I am still living in his homily to stay present. I'm just letting you know that.
You know what? As your boss, that's good to know.
I don't really know what I'm saying today. I don't know what's going on with the COVID and the brain. So, but maybe that's another reason I'm living in the present. I am very well rested.
Which is kind of a surprise, because I know you were up early today, because to transition into the topic of the day, right. You were good enough to share the feed. So we're recording this on the day that the funeral mass for Pope Benedict XVI was held in Rome, the Vatican. And there's been a good deal of coverage about it today, and I'm sure and there has been in the weeks and the few days since the Holy Father Emeritus passed a few days earlier. So we wanted to have a special episode all about Pope Benedict XVI, the former Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. And we invited on to the show one of our favorite guests, who we don't have on nearly enough because he's so busy, and he's a very important job in the diocese. He's the Chancellor of the diocese, but he has, before I bring him on, I do want to encourage people to go back during the COVID times, during the height of the pandemic. He was a co-host of a YouTube show we did called Faith and Reason with his fellow priest and his predecessor as Chancellor of the diocese, Father James Bartoloma. It was all about faith and reason and sort of the academic, spiritual approach to our faith. So it was just a great conversation. So I would ask people to go back and look at that video series, because it was really well done, and they did a fantastic job. But he's also a fantastic person to talk about Pope Benedict XVI. So, Father Jason Rocks, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with the two of you and to talk Catholic for a while, right? Great. I think Pope Benedict would enjoy that. He often talked Catholic. I would say he always talked Catholic.
I tend to agree with you. Although if you before we start, is it okay to fall asleep during Mass?
Thanks, Mike.
So no, do not fall asleep during Mass.
Okay.
Right? I know a lot of people are like, oh, well, Joseph slept and the angels came to him, and those things are true. Be attentive during Mass, be engaged, right? It's another thing to sit in a time of prayer, whether you're in church or some other place, and fall asleep. That's not unusual, and that's not necessarily discouraged by many of the spiritual masters, primarily because it says that you've become at rest, right? And that you're at peace for a moment. Sometimes we can come to prayer just filled with anxieties and stress and tensions, and so many things are on our mind, right? But to sit quietly and to begin to really rest ourselves and to drift off, that's not unusual. It's not per se encouraged. Like, don't go to prayer just to sleep. That would be wrong. But if you do fall asleep, don't beat yourself up. Rest for a bit. Wake up refreshed and let your mind focus again on the Lord, right?
Wow. Put one in the win column for Jen. Look at that.
Yes, I'm very excited.
If I see you sleeping at church, Mr. Walsh, I promise we will all quietly leave you there.
Well, thank you, because I have a feeling my soul could use that, even if it's only through osmosis. Well, so we had the funeral mass for Pope Benedict XVI today, and I know this is a pope and a cardinal that you have a great deal of knowledge about in your time as a priest. Can you give us some impressions you have of Pope Benedict XVI?
So when I think of him, you can't help but think of his time as Joseph Ratzinger. Granted, he takes on a new name when he became the successor of St. Peter, and in a sense, a new persona and stuff like that. But that still stays with him, and perhaps more than any other pope, because he was so well known and so well written. Right, he wrote so many things and had spoken so many places. So he was really well known. So you can't really go against split the two, so to speak. But he always had this larger than life image, at least within the church, right? Because he was a big name and he had a lot of weight and stuff like that. And one of the things I always remember is he ordained a class that was a couple years ahead of me when I was a student in Rome. And so he ordained them to the diaconate at St. Peter's. And everybody in the house had to have a job that week. You had to do something during this ordination. I was a part of a group that made a human wall so that the procession could make it from the sacristy to the altar of the chair in the basilica. And you're watching all these guys walk by, and then he's all the way at the very end. And I was struck by how short he was. And I was really taken back, because I always just thought, he wrote with such authority and such confidence and things like that. Like, you'd be like this big man, and he's really kind of small. Yet when he got up to speak, to preach and to give the homily during that mass, the whole place, you could hear. I mean, there's always a buzz in the Basilica of St. Peter's, but you could hear him. Like, the whole place was quiet. Mm-hmm. People wanted to hear what he had to say. That's kind of how I think of him. He was somebody that really contributed to the advancement of the study of theology, and even of culture and of philosophy as well. Yeah.
I know every my apologies. I have a number of notifications going off on my computer right now. I apologize for that. I know every pope is, by definition, considered a theologian, but in the case of Pope Benedict XVI and as Joseph Ratzinger, he very much was a theologian. I mean, this was someone who had written about the faith for decades. I mean, his writings were famous long before. I didn't even go so far as say long before he'd become a cardinal.
Correct. The when we really think about what is a theologian, we tend to think a theologian. We think of somebody like Cardinal Ratzinger, right? Joseph Ratzinger, or Rahner, or Kung, or Schittelbeck, one of these guys that writes books and all these things. Right? But Ratzinger really had a true theological bent, in the sense that he understood theology to really be a study of God, a true contemplation of the inner life of God. Mm-hmm. And I think that comes through in his reading, in his writings, rather. Mm-hmm. That when you go back to, he mentioned the word logos a lot in his theology, and even in his time as the Holy Father, right, as the Pope. And he would stress this idea of the logos, the divine logos that we find in the prologue of St. John's Gospel. Mm-hmm. And he really brought that in the sense that the logos sometimes we just leave it as, well, it means word, right? He said, no, it's a deep meaning. There's a lot behind it. There's another Greek word for word. Mary says it when she says, let it be done on me according to thy word, right? She uses a different word. She doesn't use logos there. So logos is much more profound, is what I want to say. And that the logos is also associated with the mind. And it's associated with, an account of things, right? An account of being. And to really get into the logos is you're talking about rationality, reason. And for Cardinal Ratzinger, from the time he was a young theologian, probably in the seminary when we first started to really learn these concepts, all the way through to his death as Pope Emeritus Benedict, I think he always saw the rationality, the logos, and that this was the commonality, that everybody who can reason and can think and can know can somehow encounter God. Mm-hmm. And that God was truth, or he is truth, right? And that this doesn't weaken God in any way. It makes him very perfect. And that we're called to realize that we are created in his image and likeness, and we are created to be with him, right? Yeah. And that Jesus really is God incarnate, the Logos, the divine Logos. And that really does give me meaning and purpose in my life. It leads me towards that path of perfection. It changes how I live. And so I think his whole theological project as a theologian, and then also his project as really the successor of St. Peter, was to guide people into this direction, to really encounter God here and now, and to allow that encounter to really change your life and give purpose and meaning in terms of how you live, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not, knowing the faith isn't just like I know times tables, but I don't think about it, right, until I really need it, which is very rare. Thank God, that was terrible at times tables.
Yeah.
But knowing God is so much more different. Knowing the faith, because that really takes root and it transforms how we live and encounter the world.
And also the idea that truth and reason go together, correct? That they're not separate. Yeah.
That truth and reason go, but also that faith, or that God is a part of that. Right. So he constantly, what his part of that whole movement of theology that he was a part of was to really engage the contemporary world, right? To not be afraid of the contemporary world, which he certainly was not. And to really listen to what the contemporary world said, and then to take what is true from that, and then tie that back into how it relates to our knowing of God, right? And to engage what was wrong in that and try to redirect it back toward what was right or is right. And so that was he was very open to encountering the world and encountering other religions, and he would remind the contemporary universities, right? He would remind them, a university, to be a university, really needs to have a chair of theology and a chair of philosophy, right? And that all the other sciences need to be opened also to the experience of the religious, right? That religious experience, that idea of God. And he would remind them of that, because that's part of our lived experience. That's part of what we are. It's knowable. The world is knowable. Truth is knowable. And that the world is more than just the material things that we encounter right now. That there is something more. And when we lose sight of that more, we fall in on ourselves, and we just become a group of individuals that never get anywhere together.
It's interesting to hear you say that is his relationship to contemporary times. I feel like certainly Cardinal Ratzinger, I'm not sure if this is necessarily true of Pope Benedict, but Cardinal Ratzinger, often his detractors would say that he was attempting to bring the church back to the Middle Ages, to the time of the primacy of the faith at that time. But you don't actually get that impression when you actually read the writings, and then certainly his papacy did not suggest that in any way, as far as I was able to tell, that he was trying to take the faith in a different direction other than the natural growth of the faith, within parameters, but the the natural growth of the faith. Could you ever get an impression from why his detractors sort of had that opinion of him?
So it's rooted back into the understanding of the Second Vatican Council, really, right? There's two main schools that kind of come out of that. One school really kind of held on to this idea of continuing to question and progress, and that as if the council's work wasn't done, right? Mm-hmm. The other school is the council's work is done, and now we need to take what the council has done and implement it, but always in light or always in union with what had come before, right? And to remember that it's the apostolic faith that we are to hold on to, right? It's the positive faith that we need to make accessible to the contemporary world, right? But it's that same apostolic faith or the positive faith that leads us really into union with God. So when he becomes, number one, a bishop, he begins to really take serious, well, it's my responsibility not just to speculate about things, but to actually teach the faith, right? And then when he becomes the secretary for the Congregation of Doctrine of Faith, it's that congregations or the dicastery today, it's their responsibility to make sure that things that are written and spoken about that theologians do or is all in line with that apostolic faith. That's a positive faith, right? And so that was his job, and he took that duty very seriously. So a lot of this really comes from his time as the prefect for the congregation, right? When he steps out of that role, we see him again more as that pastor who is a teacher, right? And one who wanted, again, to continue to really make the faith accessible to the world, right? Mm-hmm. So, we have a lot of talk these days about missionary discipleship, right, from Pope Francis. If you go back to the year of St. Paul, that Benedict initiated, it was the same thing, was it not?
Yeah.
That Paul encountered the world of his time and he engaged in it, whether he was speaking to the Jewish world back in Jerusalem or the Jews are part of the diaspora, or if he was engaging with the Greeks or the Romans. He seemed to know how to bring the faith into relationship with that and to spread the message of Jesus Christ, right? And he always comes back to it's Jesus, the incarnate Word, who was crucified, died, buried, rose, and ascended, right? He always kept those. That was part of the message that he preached, right? Our faith in that, this is our faith, right, in Jesus. So he was constantly trying to engage the world. That was the whole point of the year of St. Paul. And he was, again, as a teacher, right, when we look at, he wrote, or at least it was under him that the Declaration Dominus Jesus came out, where we reminded theologians and all people, salvation comes through Jesus Christ, and the church has a connection to that, right? He said, we need to reiterate this truth. But he also would write about finding the truth in other religions and how that's that seed of truth that the fathers always talked about, right? And use that as an inroads to preach the gospel, to bring people to the Lord. So he was constantly engaged in these things. And I think once he stepped out of that role where he had to always be, okay, listen, I got to correct you here, and became more of a pastor again, we saw that. His Wednesday audiences about St. Paul, about the apostles in the early church, and about the fathers of the church and the doctors of the church. These are all not just about, hey, here's like a great theologian or something like that, but here's somebody who really lived the faith and how the faith transformed them, as an example for all of us.
Do you think that, so we talked a little bit about his detractors, but he certainly had a wealth of supporters in the faith. Did you ever get the impression that there was disappointment by some of his, for lack of a better word, biggest fans of the Ratzinger years, that when he became Pope, that he wasn't a little bit more like he was as the prefect?
There may have been. I think I think some of the people who really became enamored with him during his time as the prefect failed to really recognize the more radical, we might say, Ratzinger of the council. During the council, he was a part of that, really, what would have been considered like almost like that progressive movement, right? But they were all kind of thrown in this, like all these different theologians. So he was worked with Rahner and all these different people that then come on the outskirts. They kind of fall out of favor as another whole group, such as De Lubac, Yves Congar, Balthasar. They become like the conservative wing of the council. But people fail to realize that at the time of the council, all those guys were not considered conservative at all. They were considered as progressives, theologically and otherwise. So I think as he continued to mature as a theologian, as an intellectual, and took on more of the understanding of his role as a bishop and as the successor of Peter, we see that he valued a lot of what was in the tradition of the church, including its liturgy, but also recognized that the council was valid because he was a part of it, and that if you implemented these things properly, that it would help contemporary man find answers he was looking for or is in search of. Okay? So a lot of people just thought he was super conservative because he was the head of the doctrine of the faith under John Paul II. I don't know they actually had a real radical shift as a lot of people think. I don't think he necessarily became more conservative. I think he remained the same, and those who continue to be radical just continue to progressively become more radical, as where he remained where he was in the 60s to some degree. I mean, there is a couple areas where you can show a little bit of a change. So I often think of his, during his time as prefect of the congregation, he wasn't like a real big fan of Episcopal conferences, right? Particularly in terms of giving too much authority to their teachings and things like that. Yet back at the time of the council, he was a big proponent of this. But when you read what he wrote back in the time of the council, he really thought if we brought the bishops together in a conference in the area, in the region, they would be able to discuss matters properly and formulate a good response for that particular region. Yeah. And what he found is that never happened. They didn't have those discussions, those open debates that he thought that they would have. Like he really was thinking, it'll be just like Nicaea. They're all going to argue and they're going to scream out and maybe somebody will get punched in the face. It'll be awesome. That didn't happen. What he saw was a bureaucracy kind of take place where somebody would write a document, they'd have a couple votes on it, and then and he said, that's not what he had envisioned, So like it's that type of stuff. Did he really change as much as people think he did? It's hard to say. I don't know that he did. We all develop a little bit, but I don't think he was all that radical to change. I think he really took serious his time as the prefect of the congregation to make sure that the deposit of the faith remained the deposit of the faith. He knew people were owed that opportunity to know the faith in its purity. Because that's the faith that saves.
It's interesting that you say that because I am not a student of Cardinal Ratzinger or Pope Benedict XVI. I'm not a student of anything. I'm an idiot. But the thing that I could never quite figure out was that how could someone who was part of something as progressive as Vatican II, progressive and little p, as Vatican II, also be considered someone who was trying to take the church back to the Middle Ages, though certainly his nickname what was it, the Rottweiler of the Faith?
Rottweiler of the Faith,
yeah, was certainly well earned during his time as prefect, but it just never materialized in his time as pontiff. Though, I mean, that wasn't to say he wasn't hardcore in some ways, in the manner in which he he held the faith. I was just actually reading yesterday or today, maybe, I forget which. He laicized more sinful priests than any pontiff before him, sort of as a result of the sex abuse scandal. And I think there's something to be said for that. I know he gets dinged for not having done enough to reprimand the bishops, but for a what was explained to me once that in Rome, where we think of things in terms of days and years, in Rome they often think of things in terms of centuries.
They do. And they also keep on, we're the Catholic Church, right? And the Catholic Church is universal, and it can be very difficult trying to do these to make law, right, or guidelines for a church that's so vast, because what goes in one country might not fly quite the same way in another. So it's very difficult. The other thing is the church, because she's old, she deals with things sometimes not in a way of contemporary sociology or psychology. She looks at it through a 2,000-year lens, like, oh yeah, we've always been dealing with this stuff, and this is how we do it. Sometimes she's a little slow to catch up, and other times she's ahead of the curve. So it's you never know how that's going to. It's easy to judge it from the outside and not understand the greater complexity sometimes from the inside.
I know in speaking with some people around the diocese on the passing of Pope Benedict, some of the comments fell along the lines of that they hoped Pope Benedict would be remembered for the emphasis on doctrine, and also that he emphasized a lot about what the church says yes to instead of what the church says no to. Is that something that you also saw in his teachings or the way he preached?
I certainly would. He was actually more positive on things, and he was also in charge in some turbulent times, right? In terms of priests and bishops trying to figure out who they were, church trying to figure out, well, how do we operate as Vatican II church and all that kind of stuff, right? While also dealing with a huge cultural change, cultural shift that was eroding what was left of Christendom and was replacing it with a lot of ideology that had a lot of false promises, and how even some of that would affect the church, right? So he was always very much in terms of, let's make sure that we're never in like a cheap vacuum. Let's make sure that we really know what we're talking about. So if he talked about justice or peace, he would say, well, what do you mean by that? And where does that come from? Mm-hmm. How's that something that's a universal norm for everybody, and not just your own particular understanding of it or your group understanding of it? Let's not let the gospel become all about the kingdom, which you mean as a Marxist kingdom, something that's established on the earth, which will never happen. But let's really be focused on it's a kingdom that's in God, right? That the kingdom of God is God in all things. That's what the kingdom of God is, right? And that we're called to that. And when we lose sight of that Jesus is the incarnate God, then we start to have problems in terms of relating as a church that has something to give, right? And that was one of the reasons he wrote the works that he published as Joseph Ratzinger, not as Pope Benedict, to make sure everybody knew this was a theological reflection as that was his life's work, really, when he put out it's really a 3-part series of Jesus Christ, right? And one's on the infancy narratives, and then one's on his public ministry, and one's on the Holy Week, right? But it's all about engaging, number one, who Jesus says he is, right? And showing that and why we can accept that, but also how that engages the rest of the world, what that means, how that changes things, right? So he would often talk about how God enters into human history, right? He weaves himself into it by becoming incarnate. So he's not just some kind of out there separated from it. God becomes mixed up with it. That's how much he loves us, and how that should really change how I live and how I view the world or how I view others, right? It should really bring us into a true communion that is based on really God's love or being in God, and not some forced thing that comes from outside. Right? When we have this true communion that you're supposed to find in the church, well, then it's love or charity that dictates how we operate and treat one another, right? And we're able to actually take care of one another in a better way.
There were many elements of his papacy that were important, but perhaps the most radical part of his papacy was the desire or the decision to resign after 8 years. I remember writing about that. I had a blog at the time. It was just me, spouting off, nothing big. Don't try looking for it. You won't find it anywhere. But I remember writing at the time, from my perspective, that it struck me that if that was something that was important, then Benedict, as the evolution of Cardinal Ratzinger, was probably the only pope who could have pulled that off in a way that might not create schism. Now, I know there's some debate as to whether or not it actually did do that, but when he made that announcement, it shocked the world. I don't think anybody was expecting it. Do you think that will be the legacy of his papacy?
I think it'll be a part of it because it was so, it's not common. Most popes grow old and die. And he was like, you know what? I can't do this anymore. I'm getting older. It's time for me to step down, let somebody else run it, right? And then he lived for so long after. So I think caught everybody else by surprise. So I think that'll be part of it. It'll be something to continue to ponder, because we as a church just aren't prepared for that, per se. And what do you do? He also, because he really loved the church, is why he stepped down, and also why he's like, hey, he's the Pope. I want to just spend my time here doing this. Mm. And there was a lot of that rumor about him when John Paul II died, that he was hoping to be able to resign and go back to Germany, go back to his homeland, and live a life in solitude and quiet, reflecting, because that's what he wanted to do. He just really wanted to, he'd studied enough.
Yeah.
And he wanted just now to quietly sit and reflect, I think. So I think that'll be part of it. But I really think the bigger part of his legacy will ultimately come about what he wrote and taught about St. Paul in terms of engaging the world, and also the encyclicals on faith, hope, and charity, even though the one on faith was finished by Pope Francis, right, and came out shortly after he had become succeeded him. Because here he was like, we need to get back to these basics. We need to get rooted back in faith, hope, and charity, these theological virtues that bring us into union with God and transform our lives, and then become the basis for how we live, right? And this was getting lost. And we needed to recoup this. We needed to get back into this. That as Christians, we need to really embrace these three virtues and live by them, because that's how we'll then be able to deal with the world, influence the world, but also respond to the needs of the world, including the need that every human person has to know and to love, and to be known and to be loved. And ultimately, it's to know and love God where we find our ultimate completion, right? Our satisfaction, our fullness as humans. And in that being, knowing and loving God, we're then able to know and love others as God knows and loves them. And I think this was part of what he wanted to bring us back to. Like, we need to get back to some of these basics so that we can go out and encounter the world. Right? So I would hope that would be more of his legacy than anything else. And then also just the reasonableness of God. That's reasonable to say God exists, and that God should be a part of the mix of our discussion, our philosophies, our science, our sociology, our psychology. And we shouldn't shun that. We shouldn't break that off as if, it's just some myth or just something that doesn't add something some crazy people think. But rather, that's part of the reality. And the only way to know reality well is to have God as part of the whole cosmos, so to speak, right? Or the whole, as part of the picture, right? It's one of the elements.
To that point, is there, because that's always something that I've talked about on the podcast a number of times, that science and faith can coexist. Mm-hmm. Are there writings you can recommend from Benedict Ratzinger that people could read to understand that more fully?
I think one of the works that is out is a small work of, I think it's Christianity and Crisis of Culture. I think it's the title of it. It's by Ignatius.
Okay.
And then there's another work. Another work would be Without Roots. And Without Roots is a talk that he gave, and then an exchange of letters that he had with the former prime minister of Italy, whose name escapes me at the moment, who also gave a talk on a similar topic. They were both talking about the crisis in Europe in terms of Europe losing its identity. And they both tie this back into Europe is losing its identity because it's lost its connection to Christianity. And when we say that, we don't mean just it's lost its connection to religion. We're really saying it's lost its connection to God, right? And the problems that they're facing because of it.
That is, I'm going to take it upon myself to read both of those. So I've said on many.
Small.
Even better for me. Thank you.
Yeah.
And what did you say? They're small.
They're short works. They're not. Otherwise, I know he's touched on those various things in different places. You can also read his in a brief summary form, really, of all that. The what's it called? The Ratzinger discourse.
Ratzinger discourse.
And most of that gets called, I can't say Ratzinger. What is it? Ratzinger, that's it. Where most of the hubbub about that was because of what he said, quoting the emperor about the Muslims, right? But that whole thing is really about society and faith and reason. And he explains a particular type of science that we have today where we base everything on that. And if you can't use the contemporary scientific method of proof, then it's worthless. But how that doesn't really help us live as a community, And that's also very short. That's a very brief talk, actually.
These suggestions are getting better and better. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. If he did any in picture form, that'd be also helpful.
There's another fun or neat little read is also, I think it's called In the Beginning. And it was a series of homilies he gave when he was a bishop on the creation narratives from Genesis. And he touches again on faith and reason and science and these different things. Again, another short read.
When I, in my formative early 20s, when I was, I've talked about this on the podcast a number of times, there was a small group of us who would get together with some regularity. It was, I was growing up, I was a typical cradle Catholic with limited appreciation for my own faith, just kind of the guy that went on Sundays and whatnot. And then I met my wife she was my girlfriend at the time, and I met her crew of Catholic cronies. And what I quickly found out was that they were quite literally a Cardinal Ratzinger fan club. I believe they may have had T-shirts. And I appreciate that about them. But I didn't have that upbringing. I wasn't a particularly doctrinal Catholic in the early days, and I'm barely one now. But, I had a great appreciation for Cardinal Ratzinger because of their appreciation of Cardinal Ratzinger. And as I remember being not particularly shocked, I remember when John Paul II died, thinking that it seemed to be the most obvious choice that Cardinal Ratzinger would replace him. Do you remember that being the feeling of the time?
So I didn't necessarily think he would either accept it or get the votes. But after he was elected, one of the comments that was made was he was the only person in the room everybody had met and known.
Mm.
Because when they went through their ad limitas and when they came to Rome, all the cardinals, they met with him. And they had read a lot of his writings, or they'd had correspondence with him. So he was the most known cardinal in the room, not just out in the outside world, but even amongst that group. So that they said it almost wasn't a surprise, because when they would sit there and think, well, who could John Paul II really was larger than life at times, right?
Yeah.
And he was known as the philosopher pope. And he really was. In fact, they say he really didn't start to write as a theologian until he became a pope and had a theologian watching over him. But he could take on all these things, but also knew all the issues that were going on in the church because he was the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Mm-hmm. So he really knew what was going on. And so he was one of the few people in the room that everybody had really met, but also knew his mind. Because they'd all would have met the Secretary of State as well, but you don't hear much about his writings. Yeah. Everybody knew, Ratzinger. Ratzinger went around, gave talks, in these things. So it wasn't that surprising that he was elected. I think it was more surprising that he accepted, because there was already speculation before John Paul II had passed that he was kind of like, oh, maybe I'll be able to get out of Rome.
Yeah.
And go live this quiet life. And that didn't happen for
him. Jen, when you were, I forget how this falls into your professional career, but were you working for the church at the time when Pope Benedict resigned?
No, I was working for secular press, which I remember that very clearly. I was off that day. And, that was around the same time that I was just coming into the Catholic Church as an adult as well. So I went down to my parents in Atlantic City and we watched the conclave and the smoke together, actually. And then they called me and said, hey, can you come to work? Because there was a new pope just elected. And I was like, all right. So I drove from Atlantic City all the way up to Somerville. That's why so that was a 2-hour drive. But, like I said, coming into the church as an adult, it was interesting for me because Pope Benedict is the one that I studied a lot. I lived in Germany while he was Pope. I had a lot of downtime because I was only working part-time while we were stationed in Germany. So I read a lot of his encyclicals. And to me, who was still learning, that was very helpful for me to understand more of the church teachings, not what I had learned in RCIA, but more of the doctrine and why we believe what we believe. And then also why we do it in communion. There were a lot of his writings were about, not learning in a void, but, the communion and the Eucharist. So as a kind of person who likes to read, and it's more not just theological, but educational. It was pastoral and educational. I was reading a lot at the time. And it was neat also because I was in Bavaria and that's where he was from. Mm-hmm. So I was very fortunate to be in Germany while Pope Benedict was Pope, because I feel like it helped me learn and also have a different connection to that Pope than I may have had at a different time in my life.
I will say that I was disappointed. Only today did I realize when I visited Germany a couple of years ago how close I was to his home in Markthal, Germany and Bavaria. And had I realized how close that would have been, I absolutely would have taken a trip over there and venerated his childhood home. Because I mean, let's face it, as you know, as a theologian, as a priest of the church, he's had a remarkable impact. I would dare say, perhaps even from a theological standpoint, perhaps the most important priest of the 20th century, 21st century. Would that be too much of hyperbole, Father Rox?
Not too much. I think he certainly was a voice of the age and has certainly shaped many priests and many religious and many laity as well through his writings. I can remember one woman that I worked with, she liked him more than she liked John Paul II. She said, I can't understand what he writes. And that was always said of John Paul II. As where Ratzinger was much more, you could engage it. You know, whether it was one of his theological works or one of his writings or teachings as Pope Benedict. His works were engaging. You could engage them, and the common person could walk away with something, in a sense.
You know, Father Rox, you talked a little bit about this, but you know, I just want to also chime in is, you know, him stepping down. There's a lot of humbleness that comes with that. I'm sure it's obviously not an easy decision. And, you know, for a man who was known in so many different ways, as you said, Mike, the Rottweiler, the theologian, but he was a joyful person who had humbleness. I mean, I can't imagine what that must have been like to realize I need to step down.
Well, and not only did he step down, but he really just, you know, he's like, yeah, I got no problem with this. I'm going to just go sit in this monastery over here and pray and contemplate. And he stayed out of the limelight, which I also think he never really wanted to be that much in the limelight. But, you know, his humility throughout, you know, like, I'm not the guy in charge right now. He is, you know, and he gave Francis a lot of support, more than what people realize, you know, in terms of encouragement and so forth. You know, and again, he felt this was the right thing to do, and I'm sure he wasn't just a whim, put that way.
Yeah, and I do think that had it been any other pope, it could have caused severe problems. But I even though there is some debate as to whether or not he should have done more to stay out of the limelight, I never got the impression he usurped Pope Francis's pontificate.
No. Yeah.
I think there were lots of people who wanted him to, but I don't think anybody could say, you know, in the history books that he did that in any way, shape, or form. So that was impressive. So I go back to what I wrote 10 years ago, which was in some ways, now maybe it's going to cause problems in the future, and nobody can predict the future, but I think it was a gift. Yeah, exactly. But I think it was a gift to the church ultimately, because coming off of the years of John Paul II, when he was so infirm that many had wished that he would have resigned, I think in some ways he kind of opened up the door to that again.
And being there, I think that also weighed on him, that he did not want to be in the public limelight as he was falling apart.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And quite frankly, do any of us want to? Because I feel like I'm falling apart right now. And I'm going to stay on radio because of that. Nobody should see this.
Well, it is true. You have a good face for it.
Thank you, sir.
Wow.
I appreciate that. Well, Father Rox, as always, thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks,
you were a delight. I really do. Please, for anyone, Father Rox has been on a couple times in the past, and he's been on our YouTube shows. So go back and check them out because they're a blast. And Jen, continue to recover from COVID, because it's going to be a busy 23, and I need you at 100%. And to our listeners, thanks. We're back. We'll be back on a regular schedule from here on out. And thanks. We'll talk to you again next week. See you, everybody.